This video is part 1 of a two-part series on privatization made in collaboration with the fantastic Balkan Odyssey, a fellow Marxist Balkan Slav who makes videos on history, politics, theory, and offers a Marxist perspective on current events. This is the theoretical and quasi-philosophical analysis of privatization. For a historical and example-based overview of what it did to communities, countries, and systems all over the world, check out his channel. I really cannot recommend it enough. The most memorable piece of bread I've ever had was one tossed to me over the wall of a bakery during the late 90s of the last century. You see, privatization and sanctions had led to massive food shortages, so a bunch of kids from the cul-de-sac got together and hurled little rocks at one of my neighbors' newly established bread and pastry making facility. If we annoyed them enough, they'd hurl yesterday's bread over the fence, and we'd all cut it up into little pieces and enjoy the semi-hardened piece of loaf together. While I look at those memories fondly, as people here like to call them the good old bad old days, it's only thanks to my adulting and partly thanks to my education that I finally understood why that was even a thing. Why did we have stacks of cash that could fill a whole suitcase laying around the house, yet not enough to buy cigarettes and cheese? Why did the two imposing factories, which stood at both ends of the street I grew up in, lay empty, decaying and turning to rust? Why did everyone stop going to work? Why did perfectly respectable neighbors start turning to crime as their only source of income? Why did everything feel like a limbo, where the old prophetized over a glass of rakia how shit's going to hell, while arguing with the hopefuls and soon hopeless youth about the coming capitalist utopia? Well, my friends, because among others, privatization, the goddess of the market, had come down to visit us lowly Slavs carrying gifts, and in our greed for jeans, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola, we let her waltz right in. So what is privatization? Well, to different systems of organization, it can mean many things. If you're from a developed, neoliberal, capitalist Western country, privatization as a concept would only apply to transformation of parts of the economy that have been traditionally ran and operated by the state. So, recently in the UK, there's been a long debate over the privatization of the country's railway system. Privatization would mean taking it from the state and putting it into the hands of individuals or corporations, which would then run it for profit. American healthcare, for example, is completely privatized from the perspective of people, living in countries decent enough not to let them die of kidney failure when they're not millionaires. But for the Americans, foreign healthcare is seen as quote-unquote free or state-run. To the complete opposite of the spectrum, oil and gas in the Soviet Union was completely state-run and was therefore completely privatized upon its dissolution. Basically, privatization is moving industries from the hands of general societal management, be it classes, unions, syndicates, states, or whatever else, into the hands of private individuals and corporations. But if something is defined as having been privatized or not depends on the local cultural understanding of what belongs to the quote-unquote people in the first place and what does not. In countries where capitalism has solidified itself, privatization is the status quo, while in others it's exactly the destruction of the status quo. Therefore, privatization is in its essence the capitalization of a society, turning whatever came before into a market-run capitalist mode of organization. A famous introductory example of massive expropriation of state ownership into the hands of large private businessmen, who we will be referring to from now on as oligarchs, occurred in a little-known country, Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. After they took power, industries were privatized en masse. Several banks, shipyards, railway lines, shipping lines, welfare organizations, and more were taken from the many and given to the few. The Nazi government took the stance that enterprises should be in private hands whenever possible. This was completely in line with the fascist doctrine of class collaboration, where wealth distribution matters not, only how said wealth can serve the top of the hierarchical food chain and the so-called nation, or whatever said top defined as the nation. That moment in history, and many others like it, set a very succinct precedent and key point about private and public property, that the two are at odds. The Nazi theft of public goods was a direct reply to the historical currents of the Bolshevik or Catalonian revolutions, which seek to abolish or at the very least nationalize said private property. The world was shown and lines were drawn. The so-called capitalist was told that everything he has is built on the backs of workers, and that as such it can be taken away at any moment. But as we know, it didn't end there. The fascists were the exact counter-thesis to this, a reminder to every worker worldwide that the only reason they get to enjoy the little things in life is because their bosses are letting them, and that can be taken away just as easily at any moment. This is never said outright, though, for obvious reasons. So how does it translate to a modern conversation around privatization? Well, we've internalized the ideals taught by the neoliberal school of thought that taxation is theft, while privatization is somehow the freeing of property from the shackles of the state. Organizations like the World Bank and the IMF tell us that private property and the free market are indistinguishable from democracy. Countries that take a different path are denied loans and are put on different authoritarian lists. Those that pursued their policies and went into full bankruptcy, like Greece, are blamed and left to fend for themselves. Figures like Bernie or countries like Norway are defined as radical for their policies, pursuing more state ownership over key industries, while conversations about nationalization are deemed to be literally insane and naturally off the table. The privatization lobby is constantly platformed, and ideas like school choice have basically instilled themselves in the American mainstream. That's why it's important to remind everyone that privatization isn't just a limited process which can simply end at some point. This is the biggest misconception about it. It's not only the USSRs and the Yugoslavias and Cubas of the world that are destroyed by privatization, as you'll see in Balkan Odyssey's video. The market's need for growth gives it the unique capability of making an argument that pretty much everything is better off being managed privately. But this rhetoric, and excuse me for trying to introduce a bit of shock value here, is anti-democratic. The choice of steering society as we've defined it in so-called neoliberal democracies is outlined in what? Well, the ability to vote and control how the state is managed and what direction it takes, right? So basically, freedom in choosing how the government issues its resources and institutions. When under the hand of a relatively effective governing body, those said resources and institutions are used to the benefit of the electorate, right? And even if they're not in the worst-case scenario, at least those very institutions are accountable to the public. So what happens when said institutions are privatized, when certain sources of income are taken away from the state, or when the profit motive is introduced? Well, every privately owned company is in effect a mini dictatorship, where the owner or owners command the direction the enterprise goes in. So, in effect, with every privatized aspect of our nation's wealth, resources, or social care, the democratic control over said institutions withers. Basically, for the citizenry of a country, the amount of control they have over their destiny quite literally depends on how much of the actual wealth created they control. Therefore, as you can see, I was not being sensationalist. Privatization advocates are literally stripping away democratic power of citizens and transferring it to the hands of a tiny minority. When someone comes into your home and steals your valuables, you get rightfully pissed. But when they take from your entire community, we just blindly nod. So, how much can we actually privatize? There has to be a limit, right? I mean, sure, we get what you're trying to say with the whole market expansion thing, but isn't a nice balance between private and state-run the best thing to hope for? Well, tell that to people living in water-scarce parts of the world where the only well in the village is owned by Nestle, the very same Nestle that sells them their own water back in plastic-branded wrapping. Tell that to people who lived in so-called corporate towns where every store, every sip of water, every kilowatt of electricity is supplied by one and the same company, which happens to also be the one and only employer. Tell that to the generation stuck in a constant cycle of poverty because their education institution's quality depends on how rich the neighborhood is. Tell that to the whole planet, which is literally burning up because we thought private individuals being in charge of our economy and industries will lead to net good outcomes. Which, if you still believe at this point, when our very ecosystem is being damaged beyond repair, then I have a really nice unused horse dildo to sell you. Accepting privatization as a common policy even once opens the floodgates for conversations about privatizing almost everything else. It's a dangerous, creeping strategy capitalists use to encroach on the little power we still have left. It undermines even the most basic concept of democracy, rule of the majority, and it's failed more times than we can count. Remember that the next time someone tries to sell you on the prospects of the free market. They will never take the shirt off your back because they don't have to. They already own all the shirt factories. As said in the beginning of this video, this is part 1 of a 2-part collaborative series on privatization. Check out part 2 on Balkan Odyssey's channel, link below. I can't recommend his work enough. Thank you for watching. If you like what I do here, consider supporting it by subscribing and donating over on Patreon. Get certain benefits and chat with me whenever. For the price of less than a shot of tequila a month, you can help this channel run. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the phenomenal patrons who made this possible, especially Deep Red Wine, Soup, Nathan Moore, B. Matt, Floshy Spin, Nibino, Cap, Red Messiah, Fredian Jarrett, Grim Water, 17, Lilia, Kayleys, Maitake Kun, Tanker Kiss Posadist, Ian Snyder, Probably Fang, 3NB1, Script, Dead Spartan 08, Jesus Salcero, Red American, Display Name, Marussia Asarabacara, Crouton and Baguette, Salmon Eggs, Neil Surio, Clement Faze, User, Alki Historiker, K. Eel, Fellow Worker, Boyan, Mike Lunning, The Muffin Van, Zane Guevara, The Poltism, Bharda Sullivan, Thomas Rawson Wood, Stuart Frank, Nikola Radovanovic, Adam Takasha Dong, Sean, Mike Gulyash, James Burkhart, Andres Amaya, Mugicha, Daniel Sack, ML 1822, Eric Gersowitz, EV Ren, Firm Tofu with Soy Sauce, Just in Case.